the one we're gonna finish today. Okay, so there are two Canvas PowerPoints in there right now. One of them is dealing with the introduction to taxonomy systematics, and what we were spending the first couple of days talking about. And the second one that's already posted in there, I posted it on Wednesday of last week, is this taxonomy one, which is nomenclature, dealing with how to name plants. So hopefully we're gonna finish this one today. If we do, we'll start a little bit into the next chapter as well, and I'll post a partial PowerPoint for that. If we don't get through it, we'll still be testing on whatever we get through up to today. Good questions about the quiz. It is in person, we're taking it in class, right? It'll be the beginning of class, it's still fresh in everybody's mind. Not multiple choice. Not gonna say there won't be some multiple choice questions on it, but the majority of the points on it is not multiple choice. Okay, 25 points each.
Just lecture material, correct?
Just lecture material, that's a good question, very good question, yeah. Just lecture material. I'll test you only in lab stuff in lab, and then only lecture stuff in lecture. If there's stuff that we're gonna be kind of crossing over with, I will reintroduce it in lab, or lecture again. So for example, all those terms that you learned this last week, dealing with seedless vascular plants, indusium, false indusium, sorry, those sorts of things, you're not gonna be tested on those terms in lab, but you will be tested on them in lecture, but I'm going to reintroduce them with an entirely new PowerPoint all over again. Right, and it'll be just what you have in the lecture portion, so that's a good question. Awesome, okay, so let's pick up where we left off in our last class. We were talking about the method by which we use to name plants. Nomenclature means that when you name organisms, you're using some sort of a formal system of rules to do it so that everybody's on the same page and everybody formats their names in the same way. That way, no matter where you go in the world, everybody's gonna understand what that name is when they see it, because everybody's using the exact same format. The method or the set of rules that we use to name specifically plants are things that were traditionally classified as plants. That also includes fungi and algae. It's called the ICN. Okay, anybody remember what it was called, what it stands for? You can go back and look in your notes.
International Code of Nomenclature. Land, plant, algae.
There we go, excellent, exactly right. That's what the ICN, make sure you know what the ICN stands for. Right, and we started talking about the principles, which is essentially the set of rules for each one of the, for this code or system for naming these organisms. The first principle we talked about is that this set of rules right here is exclusive to those groups, land plants, algae, fungi. Right? It is not going to be used to name animals, it's not going to be used to name bacteria or viruses. They have a completely different set of rules, which is why you'll find that animal names and plant names don't really match up in terms of their format, because they have a different set of rules. The other thing to remember about this set of rules right here is it doesn't apply to cultivated plants. Okay, so any plants that still need human intervention for their survival or sustainability, that has a separate set of codes that they use to name those. So you'll see weird kind of formats with cultivated plants that have sometimes X's in them and things like that. That's not something you're gonna find in just the natural native plants in the flora and the book that you're gonna be looking at. So different set of rules. This applies to both existing species today, modern day species, and extinct species in the past. So things in the fossil record that we discover, we can describe them, and we name them using this set of rules. The next principle that we were getting into and talking about was dealing with botanical names being fixed by something called a type. Now a type is going to be essentially a representative specimen. Yes?
I was gonna ask, why do they split up cultivated and non-cultivated plants?
Mainly because cultivated plants don't follow the rules in general. Okay? A lot of them are hybrids, as a good example, and generally speaking, we're not naming hybrids with this system right here. And so, and we're gonna get into that in the next chapter here, where we talk about the biological species concept, which is one of the definitions we can use for species of how it doesn't really apply very well for plants, and that's one of the big reasons why. And so oftentimes you'll get hybrids and things like that that just are not gonna use this system of classification. It's a good question. All right, now remember, I'm not gonna ask you to actually memorize the statements themselves, the actual rules, the way they're written, but I do want you to understand what they mean. So that's why I'm going through it and explaining each of them after I give you what the actual wording is in the set of rules. What this means is that everybody who's naming a plant is designating a specimen, something that they have collected, they've examined, they've measured it, they've used it to make their description for this species, and they think that it is the specimen that has the most perfect characteristics for this plant. Okay, everything that they based all their measurements on has been essentially this specimen. is the perfect example of the species. So if anybody wanted to go and see what really, when the person originally named this, what were we really thinking of? Okay? What was the actual specimen they're looking at? This is what it is. We call them a type, and there are different types out there. And so what we're getting into now is what some of the specific types are. The first one we're going to refer to is something called a holotype. Keeping in mind that in the past, you used to be able to use illustrations, and you could sometimes use a preserved culture for this. Nowadays, they almost never let you do that. Okay? Almost always, it's going to be some sort of an herbarium specimen, like what you see here on the right. Okay? And most of these are housed in very large herbaria, places like R1 institutions. You'll find them at University of Georgia, you'll find them at University of Knoxville, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, all those major R1 institutions that have those big hundreds of thousands of specimens of herbariums are where you're typically gonna find these. Nowadays though, this is the types that we recognize. There are a couple extra ones that your book may talk about, but you're not responsible for those. These are the ones I want you to know. You have your holotype, which is the specimen. Okay? You have your isotype, lectotype, and neotype. So now we're gonna go through what each one of those means and the differences between those. And while you're writing those down, I'm gonna see if I can figure out why this doesn't want to work. Let's do this. Okay, so we'll start first with our holotype. A holotype is the single specimen, or in the past, illustration, that was designated as the type of a species by the original author, the person who named it, okay, named this plant. And the person who wrote the article, the actual scientific research paper that's in the journals, okay, the published journal article that was naming the species, okay? That was at the time the species was named and the description was published, okay? So, and we'll find out in a second, there are right ways and wrong ways to publish names. One of the first things that has to happen when you do a name, when you publish a name, is you have to make sure it's formatted correctly, and you have to designate a type. So this has to be designated at the time that the publication comes out. Okay? And this is primarily the specimen that he spent the most time, or she spent the most time studying and measuring. So they think it is the best representative for that species. There will only ever be one holotype. Okay? There's only one holotype. And you can have as many copies of that as you want to, but only one of them is actually designated as the holotype. And if something happens to this, and it has to be replaced, it is no longer called a holotype. Right? Only this one can be considered the holotype. Now, if he or she that was naming this plant was a good researcher, more than likely when they went out to this population and they found this plant and they collected from it, they probably collected more than one plant. That's always a good idea. You want to have some copies of this, right? Now, if it's a small population, that may not necessarily be a possibility, but if it's a large enough population, hopefully they collected a few samples in addition to this one. Right? Those copies can't be considered the holotype because they are not the designated specimen for that species. But they're still important and they're still highly prized in herbariums because of their value. The fact that these were collected at the same time, right, by the same person at the same population. If they are, and they're essentially copies of the holotype, we refer to them as isotypes. They cannot be isotypes if they came back to the same population later on at another time and collected them. It has to be collected at the same time in the same population by the same person to be considered a true isotype. Now, typically when people have these copies right here, they don't tend to house them in the same place that the holotype is housed. Because if something were to happen to that herbarium, okay, for example, a fire, which does happen sometimes for those, then you would lose just the holotype and not all the copies. And usually these are sent to other herbaria across the country in different places, and you kind of separate them in case something does happen to one or multiple versions of this. And you can have as many of these isotypes as you want. These are important because if something were to happen to the holotype, you want to replace that type with something else. You need a new representative for that species because that holotype doesn't exist anymore, or it never existed. That's a possibility too. That's where these sort of come into play. You can designate then something called a lectotype. This is a specimen that's chosen by a later researcher, not the person who originally published the name, but somebody else, from that original material that that original author was looking at, okay? And designates that as essentially the new type specimen for the species, okay, if the holotype was destroyed, or if no holotype was designated like it was supposed to be. But in order for it to be a lectotype, it does need to be from that original material, the same material that that publishing author was looking at and using as a reference. So essentially what you're doing here is you're picking one of those isotypes that were collected at the same time, they're the same person in the same place. You're selecting one of the isotypes to serve as the new type. But we can't call it a holotype because it's not the holotype. A holotype already existed, it now doesn't exist. So now we refer to it as a lectotype instead. So we know it's more important than the other isotypes. It's the new type specimen, but it's not the holotype.
You said that is, if there's no holotype that has been, like if it's non-existent,
Yes.
how is there a?
A situation where there's no holotype. If the plant was named before the ICN existed, before the set of rules were in existence, people were naming plants. And they name them right, we've actually had to change the name so that they now follow the rules, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, but that means they also didn't designate a holotype, they didn't designate a type at that time. It's not as common, more likely what would happen in this case is that it would have been destroyed. But sometimes there are not types, there are not types of specimens out there. But what do you do if there isn't any of that original material left? Okay? Maybe this particular variant that was housing some of the isotypes was destroyed by an insect infestation. It's one of the things you have to really watch out for a variant because insects like cigar beetles or cigarette beetles will get into the plant specimens and they'll just eat them. And there's certain ones that they like more than others. So that there's essentially nothing left on the page except for dust. So things can get destroyed, it doesn't have to be a fire, it can be destroyed in other ways as well. So what if we've lost all this original material? We don't have any isotypes left or anything that they collected from that original population at that time. You still need to designate a type. Now you've lost your holotype, or there isn't one, we need to designate a type. So what can we do instead? What we do instead in that situation is we use a neotype. Neo-new, that's a good way to remember this one, NN, neo-new. This means that we're choosing a new specimen and serve in place of the holotype that is not from that original material that the original publisher had. Okay, when he was actually publishing the information, measuring the plants, observing and collecting data regarding those specimens, this was not a part of that collection that he was looking at. It's a completely separate one that somebody else has decided, and we don't have anything to go by from before, so I've got to pick a new one from completely different material and hope that it's representative of the species. That would be a neotype. Okay, so now we know what our second principle is. We've got to have some sort of specimen that's designated as the type. Let's look at number 3, and I'm sorry to say this is a pretty wordy one. Okay, this one goes, and that's why I've actually broken it into some different colors. We're going to color coordinate here, and I'm going to talk about what each one of those different parts talks about, because they're sort of all related, but they are saying different things. So I'll read the whole thing first. A guiding principle in botanical nomenclature is priority, the first publication of a name for a taxon. The formal starting date for purposes of priority is May 1st, 1753, the publication of species Plantarum by Linnaeus. However, to avoid undesirable destabilizing effects of strict enforcement of priority, conservation of family, genus, and species name is possible. Okay? So let's break it down, take it step by step. Let's talk about the blue section right there first. We're just talking about essentially something called priority of publication. Okay? What this is saying is that if you've got two different taxonomists, two different plant ecologists here that are studying the same plant, and they don't know this, and they're independently looking at the same specimen, both saying, oh, this is new, I can name this, and they're both writing papers about this, and they're both trying to get them published. And they do both manage to get them published because one of them is in peer review while the other one is just being submitted, and that's always a possibility. This rule right here allows you to figure out which one of the names that have been put forward is actually the one that should be used. That should be the formal name, okay? The idea here is something called priority publication. You have to find the one that was published first. Even if it was a day earlier than the other, it still was published first. And that is the one that is the official name for the species, right? The specimen. So that's why you oftentimes will see them rush to get this out as soon as possible, because you only get the rights and the prestige of naming the plant if you get there first. And you have to follow the right publication process to do this. So first correctly published name is the one that's used. That's what the blue section is saying right there. Now the green section here, when it says the formal starting date for purposes of priority is May 1st, 1753, with the publication of Species Plantarum by Linnaeus. What this is essentially saying is that the first publication that they recognize as being a valid, verifiable publication that they recognize as being a true publication that's formatted correctly is Linnaeus's book, Species Plantarum. So if it's in that, that's the name you're supposed to use. Right? Anything that was written before that is not considered a valid publication, at least for nomenclature purposes. Right? So this is the first one they recognize. So if something was published later, right, after this, because it does happen frequently, we refer to those later published names as something called synonyms. Now Linnaeus, he named a lot of plants, and you're gonna see that in your Plant Life of Kentucky. Your lab book is gonna have a lot of different species in there that are attributed to him, because it's in this book right here. But if it's not in his book, right, that means you have to find the next oldest publication, right? So beyond him, not before him, right? But before or after this book right here, what is the oldest publication that exists for this particular plant species? That's the name we're supposed to be using, right? But if it's in his, that's the one we use. And you'll find a lot of plants have a lot of synonyms, lots and lots and lots of synonyms. We also refer to an old plant name when a plant name is changed as being synonyms as well. And we'll talk about there's multiple reasons why a name might get changed. One of them may be because it didn't match this priority publication, right? We've actually found an older name, which means we have to change the name we've been using because it's no longer correct. Right? With one exception, and that's where this orange part right here comes into play. This clause in the sentence actually provides a way for us to allow really well-known, widely used plant names to persist, even if they're not the oldest ones. Right? There's an older one that exists, so technically, by this rule right here, that older name should be the one that's being used, but nobody knows it. And if we change it at this point, it's going to cause a lot of confusion. Right? So we're trying to minimize our destabilizing effects here and complicate things and confuse things by trying to use a name that nobody knows and is familiar with. So this allows us to keep some of those newer names only in that situation where it's going to cause confusion for them. We refer to those as conserved names because they're technically not the right one. The only way that we're allowed to do that, though, is it has to be voted on by that Botanical Congress, the one that meets every 6 years. Right? So somebody can't just say, I'm sorry, I don't know this name, and I'm going to be so confused if I use this, therefore I'm going to use this newer name, I just like it better. You can't just make that decision yourself. Okay? This has to be something that's agreed on by that Botanical Congress before people can actually designate that as the true name. So hopefully color coordinating it helps a little bit, right? Recognizing what all the different parts mean there. And I did want to reiterate, right, we do consider publications before his time valid, but not for nomenclature purposes. That's what that means. Okay, number 4. The intent of the code is that each taxonomic group of plants has only one correct name that is accepted worldwide, provided that it has the same circumscription, position, and rank. Okay? The only way that this universal method of naming things, this formal system of naming things works, is if there's only one name for every organism. If you start having situations where one country does one thing one way, another country does it another way, you don't no longer have a universal identifier. That organism, that species can only have one name, right? Otherwise it doesn't work. And so we have run across problems in the past where, because this particular set of rules actually applied to a little bit wider range of organisms than what it does today, they've just recently changed that. We actually had some types of organisms, certain types of produce, for example, that had two different names. One under, for example, the nomenclature for zoological studies, and one underneath the ICN. You can't have two names, right? Even if they're both sets of rules, you have two names there, and that's not gonna be a universal identifier, and it causes confusion, so you can only have one. So we've kind of grouped the systems now so that there isn't that overlap that we had in the past, to make sure that every organism only gets one name. Okay, number 5. Names of texts that are treated as Latin. They don't necessarily have to be original Latin words, but they do have to be Latinized. So what that means is that either the name has to consist of direct Latin words that are in the Latin language, okay, in the vocabulary, or the name must be Latinized, meaning that it has to follow the rules of grammar for Latin. So we convert it from a vernacular into Latin and use a set of rules for the Latin language to make sure that they're formatted correctly. Now, most likely, none of us have taken Latin as our language, most likely, unless you had it in high school. Right? Some people had it in high school, and I really, truly wish that I had. I took German because that was one of the few options we had there. Liked it, interesting language. I've lived there for a year and a half before, so it was useful, but in terms of science, Latin would have been way more useful if I'd had some Latin courses. But most languages that you look at are gonna have some similar rules in terms of grammar that Latin does. One of those is that every single noun actually has some sort of a gender associated with it. American language or English language doesn't have that. But Spanish will have that, German has that, Latin has that. So for example, in a scientific name, you've got your two parts here, your genus name, your specific epithet. The genus is usually some sort of a noun, a Latin word, a noun. And nouns have a gender. They're either masculine, feminine, or neuter, right? And you just kind of have to memorize that if you're learning the language. Now that means that they're going to have specific endings associated with it. If it's a masculine noun, it needs to end in US, ER, IS, or R. Right? If it's feminine, A, RA, IS, RIS. Now you don't have to memorize this. Right? And neuter, UM, RUME, RE. Right? So that tells you something about the actual noun. What gender is it? The second part of scientific name, usually but not always, is usually an adjective. And that's describing that noun. The adjective will, if it is an adjective, will usually end in the same ending that the noun ends in, because it's not a noun itself, it doesn't have a gender. So we're going to use the ending that we used for the noun that it's describing. There are some exceptions to this though, right? Because every once in a while there'll be a specific epithet that actually is its own noun. And if it's its own noun, it has to follow its own gender in terms of its ending. The other exception to this are trees. I don't know why, but for some reason botanists always typically consider trees to be feminine, okay? So you may have, for your genus name, the noun over here, a certain ending like quercus, and quercus, as you can see, should be masculine. Pinus, that would be masculine. But then you go to the specific epithets, the second part of them, you've got Pinus tata, Quercus alba, Quercus rubra, which are ending in an A, making them all feminine. So for some reason, they don't use these rules sometimes for the trees, and you'll see those endings don't always match. If they do, it's useful and helpful though, because as you're learning in lab, you've got to learn some of these scientific names. Typically, your endings are going to be the same. Okay? So Hubrizia, Lucidula, they both end in the same ending. So use that to help you a little bit with your spelling in lab. The only exceptions then, of course, will be the trees. Right? So just recognize it's a tree, and you'll know it doesn't always follow the rules there. Okay? But otherwise, you have to follow that Latin grammar rules. for any of the scientific names that you have. Number 6, the rules of nomenclature are retroactive. This is where I said I was going to come back to here in a second. Retroactive means that they have an effect on things that are already passed. Now what I'm referring to here are names that were created, right, are made before the ICN was in place, before it existed. There was a time when we didn't have a set of rules on how to name species, so they just named them however they wanted to. So they don't follow the rules, right? Which means that you may have an issue, for example, of priority publication. Right? We don't recognize this publication as being a true publication, therefore that can't be the name, so we've got to change it, right? And that also means that if it was named in the past and it's any incorrect format related on these set of rules, you have to change the name so it does match the rules, right? So old names, we've gone back to those to look at those to make sure that they're following the ICN rules, and if they don't, we've changed them, right, to make sure that they do. Some people tend to get this principle right here mixed up with something having to do with extinct organisms. They see this retroactive, they see the word past, they say, oh, this is just telling us that we're supposed to use the ICN rules on extinct organisms. Yes, we do use the ICN rules for extinct organisms, but not because of this principle right here. That's not what this principle is saying. This principle is talking about making sure that names are following the rules, even the ones that were written before the ICN existed. Okay? Make sure you know what they mean. And I realize the nomenclature lecture has a lot of words on the slides, because it's all about words. Don't feel like you have to write all of them out if you don't want to, because you will have access to the PowerPoint, so you don't have to write word for word if you don't want to. But write what you want to, that's fine. Any extra information I'm giving you that would be useful, go ahead and write that down. Alright, so let's delve into scientific names a little bit more. Hopefully most all of us know this already. This should be completely reviewed, even from 1:30. I would know we've had this multiple times. Scientific names, species names at least, are what we refer to as binomials. Binomial means that they're made of 2 parts. And we just saw that with the previous example that I gave you. Your first part was that noun, the second part is typically an adjective, right? But the 2 parts are referred to as the genus name and something called the specific epithet. Right? So the first part, I'm going to use this word right here, Vicia sativa. This is a plant we'll learn later in labs called garden vetch. It's in the pea family, pea bean family. Vicia sativa is the scientific name. Vicia would be the genus portion of that name. Format for scientific names is important. Right? You should know by now that scientific names are italicized, unless you're writing them by hand, because you can't write in italics then, in which case you would underline it. Okay? But otherwise they're italicized. But there's also a format to remember too relating to capitalization and lowercase. The genus name will always be capitalized, always be capitalized. Okay? The other part of the name, the specific epithet, is always going to be lowercase. Now oftentimes I get students who ask me as they're writing the names down on the test, because I am going to be looking for that format, making sure that you've got it capitalized for the genus and lowercase for the specific epithet. Although I will tell you, I'm not going to make you underline them. I'm going to assume that you know they're italicized, just to make it a little bit cleaner and writing on the sheet. But do use the lowercase and capitalization that you're supposed to do on those tests. They'll often ask me, they say, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do for the common names. Do I capitalize it? You've got one word capitalized, one not. This one's got kind of lower capitalized, this one's lowercase. It doesn't matter. It's a common name. There's no set of rules. I don't really care whether you capitalize them or not if they're the common names. But make sure you're following the right rule for the scientific names, because that actually is a format that you have to use. All right, so we've got italicized as well, again, underlined. A lot of people mix this one up and they call this the species name. Technically, that's not true, right? The 2 of them together are the species name, okay? You have to have them both together to be species name. Otherwise, the first part is the genus, the second part is the specific epithet. Who came up with this idea that every scientific name should have 2 parts? Carl Linnaeus. He's kind of important in nomenclature, which is why he's called the father of taxonomy. He came up with this idea that scientific names should be binomial, and 2 parts associated with them. And that's something we see kind of consistently across the board, even in animals. Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus portion, sapiens is gonna be your specific epithet. Scientific name for humans, in case you didn't know. Now, I mentioned in lab too, that scientific names change frequently for plants, unfortunately. As you probably saw, some of the names that are on the presses that I've left in there for you to study, by the way, you can go in there anytime as long as there's another class in there to study those for your first test. Some of those scientific names on the actual original labels are no longer correct because they've changed names. I've tried to put annotations in there to let you know what the new name is, but whatever's on your worksheets and your assignments in the class are the ones, the names that I want you to know, not necessarily what's on those labels. So we're gonna talk a little bit about taxonomic revision, why names change and why frequently they change. And I'm not just talking about species names, family names, all the ranks upwards are gonna sometimes change. And we're gonna talk about why that is. To understand that though, you need to understand two terms that are kind of associated with a taxonomic name. You have what's referred to as rank. Remember, all known organisms today are classified into this hierarchy that you see right here. They are in smaller and smaller and smaller groups that are more exclusive until you get down to this level here, species, where you only have one species in that level. Okay? The further up you go towards the domain, you have more and more species that are included, so those are more inclusive groups. Each one of those taxonomic groups is a rank. Okay? So this one right here, domain, is the highest rank. The class would be a lower rank than that, and it's gonna include less species than a domain does. A genus is even lower in rank, and it includes even fewer species than a class does, and so on and so forth. And you'll notice that ranks, or certain ranks, actually have specific endings associated with them in terms of the names that they're given. Okay, these are the ones that I want you to know. Okay? So remember, the ones that are in bold are the ranks that are always assigned to a plant. The ones that are not bold are ranks that are sometimes applied only if needed, but not necessarily always. So now the ones that are in bold. The ones that actually have a designated specific ending to them are phylum, and plants we call them divisions, class, order, and family. Okay? So for phylum, the ending is phyta, that's handy. Class, it's Opsida. Order is ales, and family is ACEAE. Okay? So if it doesn't end in ACEAE, then it's not a family. You'll notice that genus level, you're gonna get various endings. And that's again because we're following the rules of Latin. That has to have an ending that matches with its gender and the noun for that Latinized word. Same thing for the species. Oftentimes it'll match what the genus is, but not always. And we talked about what those exceptions are. So know those four right there and what those endings will be for those particular taxonomic ranks. The other thing to know about names, besides the fact that they're gonna have a rank, Quercus, for example, is a genus, and that's the rank it's at. Okay, Quercus rubra would be the species level. There's also going to be, for every name, a position. Okay? It is similar, but not the same thing as a rank. That is placement of a taxon as a member of another taxon of the next higher rank. And well, what do I mean by that? Okay? The only way I can explain this really the best way is to give you an example. Rosa is a genus, that's its rank, okay? And it is a part of the family Rosaceae. Okay? Not Asteraceae, okay? Not Cyperaceae. Okay? That is its position. It is a genus that is in the family Rosaceae. Whereas Aster, for example, would be a genus that is in the family Asteraceae. That's its position. It's in a different family. Same rank, different family. Okay? So that's what we mean by position. So there's our example. And students frequently get rank and position mixed up. But they are different things, and the reason we have to kind of specify those is because when it comes to changing a name, sometimes you don't necessarily have to change rank. Right? You can change just the position that that particular name is in. Move it into a different family, for example. Still the same rank though. Other times you may actually change the rank. That's a different type of taxonomic revision. And we'll get back to that in a second. Okay. Now, the other thing to know about scientific names, if you've ever had Dr. Brubaugh, I know he really harps on this a lot too. You probably are familiar with the term authority. Kind of an important thing to add with the name when you publish information about it. Okay? The authority is essentially the author of that publication that named the taxon, named the species, named the family. The person who first validly published that name. You always want to give them credit. It's just like any other information from any other publication. If you're going to take some of that information and put it in your own publication, you have to give them credit for it. That was their idea. And that includes names, right? They came up with these names. They should be credited with that. Usually you don't have to put this in every single citation within your text, but it has to be there at least once, and it should be the first time you mention the name. Okay, so here, for example, we've got a family that was named. The person who named this is somebody named Giselle. So Giselle is actually considered the authority for that family, right? This is a species, Viola bicolor. The authority for that is Persh, so he's giving credit for naming that particular plant. Linnaeus is also credited for a lot of names as well. But you don't typically see Linnaeus listed off the end of here. Usually it's just L dot. So it is okay to abbreviate. Okay? Oftentimes authorities are abbreviated. You'll find that a lot in your book. So when you're doing your collections and you're doing your labels, okay, you are going to be putting your scientific names on those. You are going to be including the authority on that. Okay? So you're going to have to go into the book and find what that is. Okay? Sometimes it's short like this. Sometimes it's a little longer. Sometimes it's going to have two names there. And we're going to get into why that is in just a second. And I'll kind of show you how you can figure out where that name ends. Okay? Sometimes it's not clear what that is. This should always be cited in scientific publications. And if you ever name a plant, you'll understand why. You want credit for that. You worked hard on that. And I think most of us at this point have a good idea of what a true valid publication is considered. Something that's peer reviewed, not a magazine like Time magazine or even Discover magazine for that matter, right? We know what a valid publication is. To have a name actually be considered a valid publication, there are several steps that have to be followed, right? There used to be 5. We're actually going to talk about what the 5th one is, but it's been recently removed by the Botanical Congress. It's no longer relevant, which is super nice, and you'll find out why that is. These are the 4 steps for validly publishing a name. 1, the name must be properly constructed and not have been used before. That's actually 2 of the ICN rules. 1, you can only have 1 name for every species, so you have a universal identifier. You can't have more than 1 name because it causes confusion. It's no longer universal at that point. And 2, we know it has to follow the rules, and it has to be in Latin. Follow the grammar rules for Latin. Second, we must clearly indicate the rank of the taxon being described. What are you naming? Are you naming a species, a variety, a subspecies, a family? And you've got to indicate in there what this name is supposed to be, particularly if it doesn't have a designated ending to it. That may not be clear otherwise. Number 3, you have to designate a specimen. Nowadays, you have to designate a specimen as a holotype. And you should indicate where it's located in that paper. What herbarium is it in? What are the coordinates for that? Number 4, the name and information must be effectively published. You need to have it in a peer-reviewed journal article that's in a journal that is readily accessible by most botanists. So botanical journals, it could be a flora, could be a manual, that's all valid, that's fine. Can't do it in Discover magazine. Something peer reviewed. These are the steps that are still considered accurate for something to be validly published. But there used to be a 5th one here. And I'm giving this one to you because I'm going to show you a demonstration in just a second that actually still has this one in it. It used to be that you also had to publish a description of the plant in Latin. You could have an English version of it if you're an English speaker. You could have an English version in the paper, but you then had to translate that and make sure that there was a Latin paragraph of the same thing somewhere in that paper. It was super annoying for a lot of people, especially if we didn't speak Latin, because you had to go find somebody to help you translate this to get it written in your, and make sure it was correct, right? Make sure it was correct in the publication, and get them to help you with that. And most botanists nowadays, you ask them, are probably not gonna be able to speak Latin. And people didn't really see the point of this anymore because if people didn't speak Latin, why are we putting this designation in the publication? So in 2012, they voted, that was one of their meetings, they said this is ridiculous, let's get rid of this, and we don't have to do that anymore. Now, if we look at this one right here, you can actually see they still have that. So this is the description of the plant in their own language, in vernacular language. This is the same thing right here, written in Latin. So they had somebody help them translate this and put it right here as their Latin description. Nowadays, you don't see those anymore in publications for plant names. But the other four things are listed here, like we'd expect you to. Here's the name. They've got the name in Latin. It follows the rules of Latin, follows grammar rules. Okay, so we've got it properly formatted, follows the rules of ICN. Then over here, they have designated what the rank is that they're naming. This is a species nova, which means it's a new species. They're naming a species, not a family, not a genus, they're naming a species. They have designated a holotype, they're telling, and isotypes for that matter, they're telling you exactly where they are, which variants they're located in, location of those. And they have validly published this in a journal that's commonly available to botanists, that's peer reviewed, Systema Botanica, which is a botany journal. All right, so let's talk about now why do names change? Why do we like to complicate things? And plant people in particular. There's some plants that I've learned, when I learned all the way back at the same time that you were at when I was an undergrad, that have changed names 5 times. I've had to learn their names over 5 times. Sometimes they'll switch back to an old one and go back to a new one and old back. It's absolutely annoying, but it happens all the time, particularly for plants. So why does it happen? Well, sometimes the people who are naming plants didn't originally follow the rules of nomenclature. Okay? Or we find an older name that existed that we didn't know existed before, and we realize we now have to follow the rules of priority publication. And we have to change it to that old name, because that was the first one that was published. Or we have determined new information about this plant and realized that where we originally were categorizing it and organizing it is actually not correct. We used to have it in this genus, but we realized, no, that's not where it should be. It should be in a different genus, or its own genus. Okay? So when we have anything like this, where we get new methods or data that show different relationships or disagreement and the rank of position of where that plant used to be, we get these taxonomic revisions and the names can change in the process. Because now we've moved it to a different genus, we can't call it by that genus name anymore. We have to call it by the new ones, we have to change the name. And I'll show you how to recognize it, whether or not something has changed in name or not. Now there's 4 main types of taxonomic revision that we can talk about, and I can give you examples that happened during my lifetime of all 4 of them, multiple examples. So we'll start off with the first one. The first one is you can actually take a single taxon and divide it into multiple ones. It used to be one entity, now it's all separated. A really good example of this is the family Liliaceae. This used to be a really big family. And the book that I used to use in lab, which is a pretty old book, the Vascular Plants of the Carolinas, had them all together into this one family. So it was not my favorite key to work in because it took a while to get through it because there were so many different species in it. They have completely reorganized this though, and they've split it into so many different separate families. Not even just the 6 that you see right here, there are more than 6 now that used to be a part of this family. These are just 6 that I'm giving examples of. But here are just some of the examples of some of the things, some of the plants that went into different families. So we used to have, for example, our trilliums in Liliaceae, they're now in Melliferaceae. They're in their own, they actually went into the Trilliaceae first, now they're in this one. They switched into this one. We have the alliums, which are the onions. They used to be lilies. Now they're considered Alliaceae, which is the garlic and onion family. Agavaceae is now the family for yucca. It used to be Liliaceae. And smilax, all of our green briars, they used to be Liliaceae. Now they're in their own family, Smilicaceae. Okay. There are a few that stayed here. Right? So for example, these right here, this one stayed, Lilium Catesbiae stayed in Liliaceae, whereas this one right here moved into a different group, Liliaceae. So they've kind of taken one, split it all apart. Much easier to now identify them, but it causes some confusion if you use an old book, because it's going to send you to the section of herbarium for Liliaceae, and they're not there anymore. Okay? So this one's been divided up. The opposite can happen though too. You can have separate taxa that are now brought together into one. And a good example of that is Sapindaceae. Okay? We used to have separate families here, Hippocastinaceae, which was the buckeye family, We had Saponaceae, this is the soapberry family because there's a chemical in the plants that when you add it to water and shake it, it gets all sudsy, okay? And then Aceraceae, right, which is where the maples were. Right? They are all now considered a part of the Saponaceae family. Okay, so to add confusion to your dendrology notes, because most of you probably learned all of your maples is this, it hasn't been in that family for a while. So why are you being taught that in dendrology? Because you're probably using the USDA plants website, which is out of date. It's been out of date for a very long time, okay? I am going to try and give you the most up-to-date name that I can. I'm always on top of that, trying to give you the most updated name, and that's what you're gonna have to learn, okay? So if you give me this, it's gonna be wrong, that's not right anymore. You're gonna have to give me Saponaceae. Same thing applies to sweet gum. Sweet gum's in a different family now as well, okay? Yes,
Somebody's gonna have to get on smart.
If I can do it, I know you guys can do it, trust me. But I wanna make sure you've got all the
Somebody
updated
needs to
names.
talk
I
about
would
this
love for
smarter.
USDA plants to get up to date, for some reason foresters just don't wanna do that. Okay, so they wanna stay with the old names, we're gonna fight with them forever on that one, but, you know, sometimes it helps to know both, okay? That being said, you're gonna find that some of your family names, even in your book, for your collection plants, are gonna be wrong as well. But I don't require you to do that for your collections, right? Because you're keying out of your plant flora, or your Kentucky book. So if you wanna use that name, use it. I don't wanna cause confusion, right? So use either the name that you've learned for site recognition in class for the collections, or use what's in the book. I'll know both, right? So I'll know which one they are. But for your site recognition tests, or ID tests, you gotta know the new ones, okay? All right. Other taxonomic revisions. You can transfer in position, okay? Move from one taxa to another of the same rank, okay? So a good example of that would be Sambucus. This is elderberry, right? Sambucus used to be a genus in the family Caprifoliaceae. It has now been moved, right? And that genus is now in the family Adoxaceae, right? So it hasn't changed rank. Sambucus is still considered a genus, right? But it's now a different position because it's in a different family. Okay, then we can change rank, right? Taxons can change rank. So remember, the ranks are the levels in the taxonomic hierarchy. So you've got, for example, domain, kingdom, phylum, order, class, so on and so forth. You can change that rank. And I'm gonna use elderberry actually as another example here, right? Not only did it change position, Sambucus, but this particular species right here, Sambucus canadensis, which is common elderberry, and we know it sometimes is black elderberry, that one actually changed from a species into a subspecies. Okay, it's now within the species Sambucus nigra. It's considered a subspecies within that. So we call it Sambucus nigra subspecies canadensis. And that's the new name for that one, because it changed rank. Right? Yes?
When it is a subspecies, do you say subspecies? When
You do
say
say
the size?
subspecies.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll have to say the subspecies. Because there is another one. I mean, a lot of times what some people will do is they'll just say Sambucus nigra, because it is true, that's what it is, that's the species. But a lot of people like to be more specific because there are different differences between subspecies. And so, which one are you talking about? This one lives in coves, this one lives in uplands, which one you want? But saying Sambucus nigra is not wrong. It is Sambucus nigra.
If you said Sambucus nigra canadensis.
No,
is
you're
that
gonna say
okay?
subspecies.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. All right. Questions about that? All right. This is what happens when you change your name. You change your authorities as well. I know we're just about the end here. I just want to get through this slide real quick and that'll be it for the stuff for the quiz. Right? If you change your name, okay, a lot of times what happens is some part of the old name gets retained, which means you still have to give credit to that old author because they came up with part of that name, but you also want to give credit to the person who's changed the name and put this in a new taxon or new rank or new position. And so you're giving everybody credit for this. Right? So as an example here, this species used to be called Sedum variegata. Watson is the one who named it that. Right? But as Moran studied this plant, he realized that it's not supposed to be in Sedum. It's actually its own genus. And he moved it into another one called Dudleya. But he kept the specific epithet here, variegata. But he, Moran, cannot claim credit to variegata because he didn't come up with that. Watson did. So we still have to give him that credit. So this used to be the old designation right here. Watson got full credit for that. Now with the new name, Watson is getting credit for part of that, right? But Moran is getting the ultimate credit because he has now renamed the plant, according to the new information that we have, right? And so you'll find that in your book. If you ever see a parentheses with the name in it, that is not the full authority. Keep looking, there's more beyond that. It will never end in just a parentheses. And don't put parentheses around your authority in your collections if it's not there. A parentheses does mean something specific, right? It has a meaning. Don't just start throwing parentheses in there. If it's not written in there, don't use it, okay? And make sure you've got the whole authority there for that species when you put those in there. Questions? All right, well, this will be where your quiz will end. This kind of